They told her the ranch was dead. They told her the land was cursed, the cattle were gone, and the man who owned it had already given up. They said a woman her age had no business walking onto a property that experienced ranchers couldn't save. What they didn't tell her, what nobody knew, was that Blackthorn Ridge Ranch didn't fail because of bad luck or bad management. It failed because someone made sure it would. My name is Rowena Hartwell. I was 27 years old when I rode into the worst mess of my life, and I wouldn't trade a single day of it. If this story speaks to you, hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because this is where it begins. The morning Rowena Hartwell drove up to Blackthorn Ridge Ranch, the sky looked like it hadn't decided yet whether to rain or just threaten. Low gray clouds sat heavy over the hills, and the road, if you could still call it that, was more washout than gravel, with ruts deep enough to swallow a tire whole. She'd been driving since before dawn, 200 miles of highway followed by 40 minutes of dirt track that punished the springs on her truck with every quarter mile. She slowed at the gate. The sign above it had been there a long time. The paint was gone, the wood warped and split, and someone had at some point tried to nail a crossboard over a crack that had only gotten worse since. The name was still readable: Blackthorn Ridge Ranch. Below it, on a newer piece of wood that someone had stapled up recently, was a notice from the county bank. Bold black letters: foreclosure proceedings pending. Rowena sat in the truck for a moment with the engine idling. She'd read the file twice on the way here: photocopied pages from a livestock consultant's assessment, a partial ledger from 2 years back, and a one-page letter from Dane Mercer himself that her employer had forwarded with a note that read, "Hartwell, you're the best we've got for this. Don't embarrass us." The letter from Mercer was 12 sentences long. He described the ranch's condition in the flat, tired language of a man who'd already gone through the stages of grief and landed somewhere on the other side of caring. 300 acres, 60 head of cattle remaining from a herd that had once topped 200, water sources producing poorly, fencing compromised, operating debt totaling a number that made Rowena breathe through her nose when she first read it. She put the truck in gear and drove through the gate. The ranch house came into view about a quarter-mile in, sitting at the base of a long slope with a tree line behind it and a collection of outbuildings fanned out to the east. From a distance, it had the bones of something that had once been well kept. The house itself was solid, 2 stories, real timber, the kind of construction that didn't cut corners. But the yard was rough. The barn doors hung crooked on their hinges, and the corral posts along the near fence line leaned at angles that suggested the ground had been giving way under them for longer than anyone had done anything about it. A man was sitting on the porch steps when she pulled up. He stood when she got out of the truck. Not quickly, but the way a person stands when they're being polite out of habit more than anything else. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered in the way that came from real work rather than effort, with dark hair that hadn't been cut recently, and 3 or 4 days of stubble that had crossed the line from deliberate into just not bothering. His hands were the kind of hands that told you more about a man than his face did. Scarred across the knuckles, rough-palmed, with a callus on his right thumb that came from years of rope work. "Dane Mercer?" she said. "Yeah." He looked at her the way people look at someone when they'd been expecting something different. Not rude about it, just surprised. "You're from the consulting firm." "Rowena Hartwell." She offered her hand and he shook it, firm, no games, which she appreciated. "I'd have been here earlier, but your road took about 10 years off my truck's life." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but close. "It's been on my list." "Long list?" He looked out at the property instead of answering that. She gave him a moment, then pulled her bag out of the cab. "I'd like to walk the property before we sit down and talk, if that's all right." "You want to see it before I tell you how bad it is?" "I want to see it before you tell me what you think the problem is," she said. "Those are different things." He studied her for a second. Then he picked his hat off the porch railing and put it on. "All right." They started at the barn. Rowena walked slowly, which she knew irritated some people. They wanted a consultant to stride in with authority and deliver answers fast. She didn't work that way. She'd learned early on that ranches told you things if you paid attention, and that the people who moved too quickly missed most of what the land was trying to say. The barn smelled like old hay and something underneath it that wasn't right. She noted that without saying anything, crouching to look at the foundation where the dirt floor met the timber sill. Moisture damage, long-standing, the kind that came not from a single wet season but from years of water sitting where it shouldn't. "When did the roof start leaking?" she asked. Dane frowned. "How'd you—" "The sill's been wet a long time, and there's a discoloration pattern on the east wall that doesn't come from the outside." She straightened up. "The roof." He rubbed the back of his neck. 2, maybe 3 years. I kept patching it." She walked along the stalls. Most were empty. The few cattle she could see through the far doors were thin in a way that concerned her. Not emergency thin, but the kind of thin that spoke to gradual, sustained inadequacy. Not enough feed, or poor quality feed, or something interfering with their ability to process what they were getting. "What have you been feeding?" "Supplemental mix from Garver's Supply. Same place I've used for 6 years." "When did you switch to supplemental?" "About 18 months ago. Grass started giving out in the back pastures." He paused. "I thought it was a dry year." "Was it dry?" He hesitated. "Not especially." She wrote something in her notebook without comment. They walked the east fence line next. It was worse than the file had suggested. Not just posts that had shifted or wire that had gone slack, but sections where the fencing had been cut and then someone, at some point, had twisted the wire back together in a way that looked intact from 10 feet away, but would give under any real pressure. She stopped at one of these sections and pulled the wire apart with her hands to show him. "This wasn't wind damage," she said. Dane stared at it. "What do you mean?" "Wire breaks under tension in a specific way. It work hardens and then it snaps clean. This was cut with a tool and then reconnected to look like it held." She let the wire go. "How many cattle have you lost to strain in the past 2 years?" He took his hat off and turned it in his hands. "More than I should have." "How many?" 30, maybe 35 head." His jaw tightened. "I thought they were finding gaps I hadn't fixed yet." Rowena looked down the fence line, calculating. 35 head at current market weight, gone over a 2-year period. That wasn't just loss, that was a pattern. She wrote it down. The water was the thing that stopped her cold. Blackthorn Ridge had 3 water sources: a well that served the house and barn, a natural spring that fed the south pasture, and a seasonal creek that ran through the back 40 when conditions were right. The file had noted reduced output from the spring without explaining why. Rowena wanted to see it herself. They hiked out through the south pasture, climbing the long rise that led to the tree line. The spring came out of the hillside in a spot someone had framed up with flat stones a long time ago. One of those small, careful pieces of work that spoke to a time when somebody had put real thought into this land. The water ran clear enough on the surface. She crouched beside it and spent a long time just looking. The flow was weak. She could see that. Maybe 30% of what it should have been at this time of year, but it wasn't just the volume. There was something about the smell of the surrounding soil that made her pause. She pulled a small glass vial from her kit, filled it at the source, and capped it. "Have your cattle been drinking from this source?" she asked. "Yeah, it's the primary water for the south herd. Has anyone been sick? Off their feed, weight loss, coat condition declining?" Dane's expression shifted. "I thought it was the drought. It wasn't a drought year, you said." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "One of my hands thought maybe the grass was poor quality in that section. I moved the herd twice, but it didn't seem to help much." Rowena stood up and looked at the hillside above the spring. The ground up there was disturbed in a way that wasn't obvious unless you were looking for it. A subtle depression in the terrain, some discoloration in the soil near a cluster of young trees that hadn't been there long. "Who owns the property above this line?" she asked. "Used to be open range. The county sold it off about 4 years ago." He paused. Granger picked it up. "Silas Granger." Dane looked at her sharply. "You know him?" "I know the name. He's in your file." She capped her notebook and looked up the hill one more time. "He's in a lot of files." Well, they got back to the house around noon. Dane's housekeeper, a heavy-set woman named Cora, who had been with the ranch for going on 15 years, put coffee on without being asked and set out bread and cold beef without ceremony. She looked at Rowena the way a person looks at a doctor who's come to deliver results. Not hostile, but watchful. "You gonna tell him it can't be saved?" Cora said, while Dane was outside washing up. Rowena poured her own coffee. I haven't decided anything yet. Because if you're going to tell him it's done, I'd rather you say it straight and not make him go through a week of false hope first. Cora sat down at the table. He's had enough of that. Who gave him false hope before? Cora's expression went somewhere complicated. The bank sent a man out 8 months ago, said if Dane could meet 3 benchmarks by end of quarter, they'd extend the loan. Dane killed himself working for 3 months, met 2 of the 3. Bank said it wasn't enough. Which benchmark did he miss? Herd count. He needed to bring in 40 head. He brought in 28. It would have been more, but he lost 12 to something in the south pasture that spring, and nobody could tell him what. She wrapped her hands around her cup. You can imagine. Rowena could. Dane came back in and sat down. He didn't reach for the food right away. He put his elbows on the table and looked at her in the direct, unceremonious way of someone who'd been waiting a long time and had decided he was done pretending the wait was fine. All right, he said. What did you see? She set down her coffee. I want to start with what I didn't see. I didn't see any evidence that this ranch has been poorly managed at its core. The infrastructure here is sound. The land has capacity. The original herd lines were good choices. She paused. What I did see is a pattern of failures that don't add up to simple bad luck. He frowned. Meaning what? Meaning I found fence line that was deliberately cut and reconnected to look intact. I found a spring that I'm going to have tested, but that shows signs of contamination from activity on the land above it, land that was recently sold. I found livestock records in your file that point to a feed supplier whose quality has dropped significantly over the past 18 months and whose ownership changed about 2 years ago. She let that sit for a moment. I found a bank that moved the goalposts on you after you'd met most of their conditions. The kitchen was quiet. Cora had stopped pretending to be doing something else at the counter. Dane sat very still. You're saying someone did this on purpose. I'm saying the evidence points in that direction. I'm not saying that because I want to cause trouble. I'm saying it because you can't fix a problem if you misdiagnose it. She leaned forward slightly. If this ranch failed because of bad luck and poor decisions, the answer is different than if it failed because someone helped it along, you understand? He was quiet for a long time. Granger, he finally said. It wasn't a question. He's connected to several of the things I'm looking at. I don't know the full picture yet. I do, Dane said. His voice had gone very flat. Or I thought I did. I thought he was just waiting to buy me out. I didn't think it went further than that. Tell me. What? He talked for almost an hour. Some of it she already had pieces of. Some of it was new. He told her about the first loan he'd taken from Granger's lending operation 3 years back, when the bank had denied his renewal application on terms that made no sense given his repayment history. Granger's outfit had stepped in with a friendly face and numbers that looked better on paper than they turned out to be in practice. Dane had signed, because that's what you do when you're 32 years old, and your father's ranch is sliding, and a man is sitting across from you offering you a way out of the ditch. The interest terms, Rowena said. Did you have a lawyer look at them? I am not good at asking for help, he said. Not ashamed of it, just stating a fact. She didn't push on that. Go on. He told her about the cattle he'd bought through a dealer named Pruitt, who had come highly recommended by 2 ranchers in the county. Ranchers who, Dane now understood, were also in debt to Granger's operation. The cattle had come in looking healthy. Within 8 months, the herd was underperforming badly. He'd brought in a vet who found nutritional deficiencies that shouldn't have been there in animals that had been on good grass and supplemental feed. And the vet's conclusion? Rowena asked. He said it looked like they'd been fed a poor diet for a long time before I bought them. That the damage was already there, he just couldn't see it in the initial inspection because they'd been... He stopped. Fed up for the sale, she said. Fattened briefly to look healthy and then sold before the underlying condition showed. His jaw was tight. Yeah. And Pruitt? Out of business. Moved on. Nobody in the county knew where. He rubbed his face with one hand. I've been trying to figure out how I let it happen, how I missed it. You didn't miss it, Rowena said. You were sold something designed to be missed. He looked at her. There's a difference, she said, between being fooled and being fool enough to be fooled. You bought cattle from a recommended dealer. You took a loan when the bank closed its doors on you. You used a feed supplier that was running fine until someone changed who owned it. She shook her head. These aren't mistakes that a more careful man would have caught. They're traps that were set carefully enough to fool careful men. Dane was quiet for a while after that. He looked out the window at his land with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between anger and something older than anger. The bank, he finally said, the one who moved the goalposts. Granger has a relationship with that loan officer. I don't know the nature of it yet, but it's in the record if you know what to look for. She paused. I want access to all your paperwork, everything you have. Ledgers, contracts, correspondence, all of it. What are you going to do with it? I'm going to figure out the full shape of what was done to this ranch, and then I'm going to help you decide what to do about it. He studied her for a long moment. You came out here to assess whether the ranch was worth saving. Yes. And now you're talking about investigating fraud. I'm talking about both. She met his eyes directly. A ranch worth saving is still worth saving even if someone tried to take it from you, maybe especially then. Cora showed Rowena to the spare room upstairs after dinner. It was a plain room, clean, the bed made with careful corners, a window that looked out over the east pasture toward the distant hills, the kind of room that had been used for practical purposes, not for show. She sat on the edge of the bed and went through her notes. The water sample would go to the county lab tomorrow. The feed issue needed a separate look. She wanted to get her hands on recent batch records from Garver's supply if she could, which would require either a cooperative conversation or a careful look at purchasing documentation Dane might have. The fence sabotage was harder to prove in the abstract, but easy to demonstrate on the ground if she could show a consistent pattern across the property. The piece she kept coming back to was the survey records. Granger's land purchase above the South Spring had been processed through the county 4 years ago. That kind of acquisition went through the assessor's office, involved survey documentation, and left a paper trail. What she wanted to know, and what she hadn't said to Dane yet because she didn't have evidence, only instinct, was whether the survey that established the boundary lines between Blackthorn Ridge and Granger's new parcel was accurate. Water rights in this part of the state followed the land. If the boundary lines had been drawn wrong, if a fraudulent survey had placed land that rightfully belonged to Blackthorn Ridge under Granger's ownership, then the spring might not be contaminated from above. It might have been cut off at its source. She wrote, check original survey, check survey company, who commissioned, who signed. She wrote, Granger paid someone at the bank, probably more than one someone. She wrote, find Pruitt, or find who Pruitt reported to. She set the notebook on the bedside table and lay back on the bed without changing clothes, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the night was quiet in the way ranch nights were quiet. Not silent, but emptied of human noise, full of the sounds that belonged there. Wind through the grass. Somewhere, cattle. A board settling in the house's frame. She thought about what Cora had said. He's had enough false hope. Rowena had not given him hope tonight. She'd given him information, which was different. She'd given him a diagnosis that reframed his failure as something that had been done to him rather than something he'd done to himself. She wasn't sure if that was better or worse in the short run. It was true, though, and in her experience, true things were worth having even when they were hard. What she hadn't told him was that she'd recognized Silas Granger's name before she'd ever opened his file. She'd seen it in a different county, connected to a different foreclosure 2 years ago. That case had ended with a rancher selling out at a loss before anyone could prove anything. The rancher had moved away. Granger had added the property to his portfolio. She'd thought about that case a lot afterward, about what she'd missed and what she could have done differently if she'd been looking at the right things sooner. She wasn't going to make the same mistake here. Morning came gray and damp, and Rowena was up before anyone else. She walked the property again alone, starting at the west boundary and working east. She moved more slowly this time, taking measurements with a hand level and a 200-foot tape she kept in her kit, writing numbers in her notebook. The topography of Blackthorn Ridge told a specific story once you knew how to read it. The way the land sloped toward the spring, the watershed patterns, the drainage channels that had been altered in small ways that anyone would call accidental if they weren't looking too hard. She was looking hard. By the time she'd worked her way to the north fence line, she'd found 2 more sections of wire that had been cut and rejoined. She photographed both with the small camera she carried and noted the GPS coordinates from the unit clipped to her belt. On the way back to the house, she crossed through the south pasture and stopped at the far end, where the grass had thinned to near nothing over a patch of ground, maybe 30 yards across. She crouched, pulled a small blade, and cut into the top layer of soil. The ground was wrong, compacted in a way that grass roots couldn't penetrate, with a gray-white mineral residue just below the surface that shouldn't have been there. She filled another vial. Dane was at the barn when she got back, working on the hinge mechanism of the large door, which had been drooping badly enough that the bottom corner dragged on the ground. He was on his hands and knees in the dirt, which she noted as a point in his favor. Some men in his position would have been waiting for someone else to deal with it. "You were up early," he said, without looking up. "I work better before people start talking to me." She set her bag down. "I need your ledgers. Everything from the past 4 years." He looked up then. "All of it?" "All of it." He sat back on his heels. "It's not organized. I don't need it organized. I need it complete." He studied her for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why does a livestock consultant know what survey fraud looks like?" She had expected this question, eventually. "Because I grew up on a ranch, and when I was 22, my family lost it to a creditor we later found out had arranged our failure. We never proved it." She held his gaze. "I got into this work because I wanted to be able to prove it for other people." He was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," he finally said. He put down his wrench and stood up. "I'll get you the ledgers." She spent the rest of the morning at the kitchen table with stacks of paper that Dane pulled from 2 different filing cabinets and 1 box from under his bed, which he set down in front of her without comment. Cora kept the coffee coming and didn't ask questions. Dane went back out to work. The ledgers were better than she'd expected in some ways and worse in others. Dane was not a sophisticated bookkeeper, but he was honest. His records were inconsistent in format, but consistent in detail, the way records kept by someone who wasn't trying to hide anything looked. She could follow the money, and the money told a story. 3 years ago, Blackthorn Ridge had been running at a modest profit. Herd count steady at 190, operating expenses in line, debt payments manageable. Then the bank loan renewal had been denied. Then the Granger loan. And then, month by month, in numbers that each seemed small on their own but accumulated into something staggering. The costs had risen and the income had fallen. Feed costs up. Veterinary bills up. Cattle losses attributed variously to illness, strain, and unspecified causes. Revenue from herd sales down because the cattle coming to market were underweight and commanding poor prices. The loan interest compounding in the background like a clock nobody was watching. But there were other numbers too. Numbers that Dane had apparently not connected because they were scattered across different months and different line items. Payments to a fencing contractor, but when she cross-referenced the dates, the fence work he'd paid for had been done in sections of the property nowhere near the damaged stretches she'd found this morning. Someone had billed him for repairs that hadn't happened where the money was supposed to have gone. She went through it twice to make sure she wasn't misreading. She wasn't misreading. Around 1 in the afternoon, she pushed back from the table and went to find Dane. He was in the equipment shed checking the hydraulic lines on a tractor that had clearly not been used in a while. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he saw her. "I need to know who did your fence repairs in the past 3 years, she said. He looked up. "Couple different guys. Mostly I used a man named Clell over near Harmon's Creek." "And did Clell actually come and do the work?" Dane's face changed. "What?" "You paid for fence repairs in March and September of the year before last. Both on the east boundary, according to your ledger. But the damage I'm finding on the east boundary is old. Some of it goes back at least 2 to 3 years. And the deliberate cuts in the wire are not in sections that have been recently worked." He was very still. "Clell came out. I talked to him." "Did you walk the fence line with him? Did you see the work done?" A long silence. "No," he said. He came to the house. We talked through what needed doing. I wrote him a check. He said he'd send a crew." "And you trusted that he had?" "I was short-handed. I couldn't be 3 places at once." His voice had an edge to it that wasn't directed at her. "I had to trust people." "I know." She stepped into the shed. "I'm not saying you did anything wrong. I'm saying Clell, or whoever Clell was working for, took your money and didn't do the work, and the fence stayed broken. which means the cattle kept getting out, which means the herd count stayed low, which means you couldn't meet the bank's benchmark. She watched him work through it. So it's connected, he said. The fence and the bank benchmark. Yes. He set down the wrench he was holding, very carefully, like he was being deliberate about not throwing it. How many people are involved in this? I don't know yet. She leaned against the shed wall. But Silas Granger doesn't run an operation like this alone. This took coordination, which means there are multiple people connected to it, which means there's a paper trail even if it's been covered up carefully. And what do we do with that? Right now? She met his eyes. We keep working. We get the ranch functional. We stabilize the cattle. We fix the actual fence. We get the water tested and deal with whatever we find. We keep moving forward. She paused. Because if we stop the ranch work to focus on the investigation, we might win the investigation and lose the ranch anyway. He picked the wrench back up, turned it over in his hands. And while we're doing all of that, he said slowly, you're going to be building a case. While we're doing all of that, she said, I'm going to figure out the whole shape of what Silas Granger did, and then we'll figure out what to do about it. He nodded once. Then he turned back to the tractor. She went back to the ledgers. That afternoon, she drove into Deering, the nearest town of any size, to drop her water sample at the county testing lab and to make 2 phone calls she didn't want to make from the ranch. Deering was the kind of small western town that had contracted quietly over the years without quite becoming a ghost town. There were still businesses on the main street, still a diner that appeared to be doing all right, still a hardware store with trucks parked in front of it. But there were also empty storefronts, and a hotel that had been closed long enough that weeds were growing up through the parking lot, and a quiet everywhere that wasn't peaceful so much as resigned. She made her calls from the parking lot of the hardware store. The first was to a property records researcher she'd worked with before, a methodical woman named Aldous, who specialized in title histories and survey documentation. Rowena described what she needed: the original survey for Granger's parcel above the Blackthorn Spring, the survey company, the date of record, and any amendments or corrections filed subsequent to the original. How fast do you need it? Aldous asked. Yesterday, Rowena said. It'll cost. Bill the firm. The second call was harder. She called her supervisor, a man named Garrett, who had been in the livestock consulting business for 30 years, and who she respected precisely because he didn't pretend things were simpler than they were. How bad is it? He asked, when she'd given him the overview. The ranch can be saved. That's the easy part. She watched a truck pull into the hardware store and a man get out with the comfortable movements of someone who knew everyone in town. The hard part is that it's not just a failing operation, it's a targeted one. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Granger. Yeah. Rowena. He said her name in the tone he used when he was about to say something she wasn't going to want to hear. What you're describing goes well past a livestock assessment. I know. This firm isn't set up to conduct fraud investigations. I know that too. And you know as well as I do that if Granger realizes someone's looking at him, he has both the resources and the inclination to make that someone's life difficult. Garrett, she kept her voice level. He set up a 20-year-old fraud operation to steal cattle ranches from families. He bribed at least one bank officer. He arranged to have fence lines sabotaged and water sources compromised. She paused. And he almost got away with it because nobody looked at the whole picture at once. They just saw individual ranches failing one by one. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. What do you need? He said. Time. And the firm's name behind me when I go to the county assessor. Another pause. You'll document everything. Every piece. And you'll keep saving the ranch at the same time. That's what we were hired to do. That's what I'm doing. She heard him exhale. All right, keep me informed. Then, Rowena, be careful. She thanked him and hung up. She sat in the truck for a moment before starting the engine. Outside, the town went on with its quiet business. A woman coming out of the diner with a bag, 2 men talking in front of the feed store, a kid on a bicycle taking the corner too fast and correcting without falling. Normal things. The kind of normal that Dane Mercer's ranch had not seen in years. The kind that Silas Granger had deliberately, systematically dismantled. She started the truck and headed back to Blackthorn Ridge. Dinner that evening was a quieter affair than the night before, but not uncomfortably so. Cora cooked, and they ate at the kitchen table, and Dane asked Rowena practical questions. What grade of wire she recommended for the fence repairs, whether the south pasture could be reseeded this season or would need to wait, what she thought about rotating the remaining herd to the north section while the spring issue was being sorted. She answered all of it straight. He listened the way someone listened when they were actually going to use the information, not just filling silence. "You always been this direct?" he asked at some point, not critically. "I've been told it's off-putting." "It's not," he said. He picked up his coffee. "It's refreshing, actually. Nobody's talked to me straight about this place in about 2 years. Everything's been hedged. Careful." He looked at the table. Like they didn't want to be the one who said out loud that it was done. "It's not done." "No," he said. "I'm starting to believe that." After dinner, Rowena walked out to the front porch. The clouds had cleared during the day, and the night sky over Blackthorn Ridge was the kind of sky you only got far enough from city lights. Dense with stars, the Milky Way a visible smear across the dark. She'd grown up under skies like this. She knew from experience that looking at them at the end of a hard day could either make problems feel smaller or make you feel smaller, depending on where you were inside yourself. Tonight it just looked like sky. She heard the door open behind her. Dane came out and stood beside her, a few feet of space between them, both of them looking out at the dark land and the bright sky. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You said that this morning already." "Yeah, well," a pause. "I've got more questions than I thought I did." "Ask." "When you were 22, your family's ranch." He was careful with the question. Did anyone come forward? Was anything ever?" "No," she said. "Nothing was ever proven. The man involved sold my family's land for 3 times what he'd bought it for, 6 months after they were gone." The night sounds settled around them. "I'm sorry," Dane said. "It was a long time ago." She meant it as much as she ever meant it. "But it's part of why I'm good at this. And it's part of why I'm not going to stop until I understand the full shape of what Granger built." He nodded slowly. "You think we can actually beat him?" he said. Not quite a question. "I think the truth is usually beatable," she said, "even when the person who's been lying is powerful." She glanced at him. "It's harder when people stop looking. That's the only way it stays buried." A pause. "Well," Dane said, and there was something different in his voice than there had been that morning. Not quite certainty, but something in that direction. "Then I guess we keep looking." She nodded. They stood there a while longer, not saying much, looking out at the land that had been stolen from him slowly and quietly and without his knowledge, and that she intended with everything she had in her to give back. The night stretched out over Blackthorn Ridge. The cattle moved somewhere in the dark. The land waited, and in the morning the work would go on. The water test results came back on a Thursday, 4 days after Rowena had dropped the sample at the county lab. She was out in the south pasture when her phone rang, walking a line between 2 fence posts she'd flagged for replacement, and she stopped in the middle of the field to read the report the technician recited to her over the phone. She didn't write anything down. She didn't need to. When she hung up, she stood there for a moment with the phone in her hand and the wind moving through the dry grass around her. Then she walked back to the barn. Dane was inside, working through the stall, mucking that he'd been putting off, because he'd been putting off a lot of things that felt small against the backdrop of a ranch falling apart. He heard her boots on the concrete and looked up. "Spring water," she said. "Elevated sulfate levels. Elevated nitrate. Trace amounts of a mineral compound that the lab said was consistent with agricultural runoff from disturbed ground above the water table." He leaned on the muck rake. In plain terms, your cattle have been drinking water that's been quietly making them sick for somewhere between 18 months and 2 years. Not sick enough to drop them fast, sick enough to compromise their immune systems, their weight gain, their reproductive rates." She crossed her arms. "It explains the herd performance. It explains why moving them to better grass didn't fix it, because the water followed them in their systems." Dane put the rake against the stall wall. He didn't say anything. "The compound the lab found," she continued, "comes from disturbed mineral deposits, the kind that get exposed when you do significant earthwork. Grading, drainage installation, that sort of thing." She held his gaze. "The kind of earthwork you do when you're installing a drainage system on a new parcel of land above a natural spring, The barn was quiet except for the sounds of the two remaining horses shifting in their stalls. "He poisoned my water," Dane said. "I can't prove intent yet. What I can prove is contamination, and I can prove it originates from activity on his land." She paused. "That's a start." He turned and walked to the far end of the barn and stood there with his back to her for a moment. She let him have it. She'd learned early on that there was a specific kind of anger that men like Dane carried. Not the explosive kind, but the deep burning kind that needed a moment before it became useful instead of destructive. When he turned around, his face was composed. Barely, but composed. "What do we do about the herd?" "We move them off the South Water entirely. Today. I've already looked at the north section. The well water test's clean. I had that checked the first day. We'll need to run a temporary line or haul water until we can establish a clean trough system up there, but it's doable." She unfolded the sketch she'd made that morning. "I've also been in touch with a livestock nutritionist I know. If we put the herd on a targeted supplement protocol for the next 60 days, we can start reversing the damage." He looked at the sketch. Cost. "Less than losing more cattle." She folded it again. "I'll pull the numbers this afternoon." He nodded. "Okay. Then, what about the legal side, the contamination? I've got a contact at the county environmental office. I'll file the complaint with my lab report attached. They'll want to do their own testing, which takes time, but it starts the official record." She met his eyes. "Every piece of documentation we build now matters later, even if it doesn't feel like it's doing anything yet." He picked up the rake again, not because there was more mucking to do, but because he needed something to hold. "You said the nutritionist can help reverse the damage." "Most of it. It depends on how long each animal has been affected and their individual condition." She paused. "I'm not going to promise you they all come back to full capacity, but I think the majority of them will." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's move the cattle." They spent the rest of that day doing it the hard way, because most things on a working ranch got done the hard way when you were short-handed. Rowena worked alongside Dane and his two remaining hands, a quiet young man named Sully who'd been on the ranch for 2 years and did whatever was asked without complaint, and an older hand named Birch, who was somewhere in his 60s and had bad knees but wouldn't admit it, and who looked at Rowena the first day with the kind of skepticism that didn't come from disrespect, but from having seen a lot of consultants come and go. Birch warmed up by the end of the first week, which Rowena considered reasonable. Moving 60 cattle across a half-mile stretch of uneven ground with 3 people and 2 working horses was not elegant. One of the younger steers decided partway through that it wasn't interested in the proceedings and broke left toward a section of fence that Rowena had already flagged as compromised. Sully went after him on horseback, while Rowena and Dane pushed the main group through the gate. "He does that every time," Dane said, watching Sully work. "The steer or Sully?" "Both, actually." The steer came back around eventually. By late afternoon, the herd was established in the north section with access to the clean well water trough that Birch had been running pipe to since noon. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a working one. The cattle went to the water with the focused indifference of animals that had no idea how significant the moment was. Rowena stood at the fence and watched them drink. "First good thing in a while," Dane said, coming to stand beside her. "First of several," she said. "Don't let it feel like the finish line." He gave her a look. "You always like this?" "Like what?" "Immediately deflating any moment of progress." She considered that. "I prefer to think of it as keeping the timeline accurate." "Right." But there was something in his voice that wasn't quite irritated. They were figuring out each other's rhythms, which was what happened when 2 people spent 12-hour days working the same problem in the same space. You started to know how the other person thought. She'd noticed that Dane made decisions fast once he had enough information, which was useful. She'd also noticed he had a tendency to carry problems alone past the point where it helped him, which was not. She'd also noticed he'd been sleeping badly. The kitchen light was on at 2 in the morning twice this week. She didn't bring it up. The ledger work continued at night after the physical work was done and the ranch had gone quiet. Rowena had set up at the kitchen table with the kind of organized chaos that looked like a mess but had its own internal logic. Stacks of papers in a sequence only she could navigate, color-flagged with a system of 3 different markers, cross-referenced by date and counterparty. What she was finding, the deeper she went, was a structure. Not just individual bad deals, but a system. A carefully tiered arrangement that separated Silas Granger's visible involvement from the actual execution of his scheme. On the surface, you'd see a bad loan with unfavorable terms. You'd see a cattle dealer who'd moved on. You'd see a fencing contractor who'd billed and not delivered. Each individual piece looked like an unfortunate transaction. You had to lay them all out side by side, dated and connected, before the pattern emerged. And the pattern was unmistakable once you saw it. She was 3 hours into the ledgers on a Tuesday night, running on her third cup of coffee, when she found the contract. It was tucked into the back of a manila folder that held a collection of miscellaneous paperwork, warranty documents for equipment, an old insurance policy, a receipt from a vet visit, the kind of folder where things ended up when someone didn't know where else to put them. She'd almost set it aside. The contract was between Blackthorn Ridge Ranch and a company called Meridian Land Services, LLC, dated 4 years ago. It described a service arrangement for, she read it twice, boundary verification and fence line assessment. It was signed by Dane on one side and by an agent on the other, and the agent's signature was illegible, but the company's registered address was printed at the top. She looked up Meridian Land Services on her phone. It took her 11 minutes to trace it. The company had been dissolved 2 years ago. Before that, it had operated for approximately 3 years. Its registered agent, listed in the state filings, was a law firm that also represented several of Silas Granger's other business entities. She set the phone down and looked at the contract again. Meridian Land Services had charged Dane $2,000 for a boundary assessment. The assessment, according to the attached document, had confirmed the existing survey lines as accurate. The same survey lines that Rowena's property records researcher, Aldous, had been quietly pulling apart for the past week. She picked up her phone and wrote a text to Aldous. Need to know if Meridian Land Services had any involvement in the 2019 survey of the Granger parcel above Blackthorn Ridge Spring. Check the surveyor's license number on that document. Aldous replied at 6 the next morning. Already found it. The surveyor on that document had his license suspended the year after the survey for falsifying 2 property boundary reports in another county. He had 3 prior jobs connected to Meridian before the suspension. I'm pulling the full chain. Rowena read the text standing in the kitchen with the coffee not yet brewed, still in yesterday's clothes because she'd fallen asleep at the table and woken up at 5 stiff-necked and with a line from the legal pad printed on her forearm. She thought about Dane, asleep upstairs. She thought about how a man could do everything right, work his land, pay his debts, make reasonable decisions with the information he had, and still be steered quietly and methodically toward a cliff he couldn't see. She started the coffee. She told Dane about the Meridian contract over breakfast. She laid the document on the table and let him read it before she said anything. He got about halfway through it before he put it down. I remember signing this, he said. A man came to the ranch, said the county had flagged some boundary uncertainties in the area, and that a lot of ranchers were being asked to do verification assessments, said it was routine. He looked at the document, not at her. I thought it was the county. It wasn't. No. He pushed the contract away slightly. $2,000 for a fake assessment, for an assessment that confirmed a fraudulent survey. She sat down across from him. The survey that moved the boundary line above your spring was falsified. The man who did it had done it before, in other counties, for other clients. Aldous is tracking the full record right now. She poured coffee into both cups. What the contract means is that Granger wasn't just taking advantage of your situation. He was engineering it, actively, years before you took the loan. Dane sat with that. He bought the land above my spring, he said slowly, put in drainage that contaminated it, then paid someone to come to me and get me to sign off on a document that said the survey was accurate, which meant if I ever questioned the boundary, you'd already certified it yourself. She nodded. It's a specific kind of fraud, the kind that uses the victim's own signature to close off their legal options. And the man who came to the ranch, Meridian's agent, almost certainly doesn't exist anymore under that name, but Aldous will find who he actually was. She looked at him steadily. This is the kind of thing that, when you start pulling threads, tends to unravel. Granger covered his tracks, but you cover tracks by leaving tracks. He drank his coffee. He had the look of someone recalibrating. taking in information that changed the shape of everything that came before it, figuring out how to stand up straight in a landscape that had just shifted under him again. My father built this ranch, he said. It came out differently than she expected. Not angry, just factual, like he was reminding himself of something. He spent 30 years on it. I grew up on it. He looked at the kitchen wall like he could see through it to the land outside. I always thought if I lost it, it would be because I failed him, because I wasn't good enough. Rowena didn't say anything. Turns out, he said, someone worked very hard to make sure I believed that. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. What now? He asked. Now we keep going. She pulled the ledger stack toward her. We're about 2/3 through the documentation. I want to have a complete picture before I approach the county assessor's office. When we go there, I want to hand them something they can't look away from. He nodded. And the ranch? The fence crew I brought in starts Thursday on the east line. Sully's been marking the damaged sections all week. By my count, it's 11 separate cuts. The nutritionist is sending the supplement protocol by end of the week, and I've been in contact with a cattle broker I trust who has a small lot of healthy animals at reasonable prices. We need to start rebuilding the herd, and I want to do it with cattle that haven't been through Pruitt or anyone connected to him. He raised an eyebrow. You found a connection to Pruitt? Working on it. I know what county he relocated to. I've got a colleague making some calls. She paused. Pruitt isn't the main target, but he's a link in the chain, and chains hold together better when you've got multiple connected points. Dane was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he said, You're very good at this. She looked at him. I mean it, he said, not flattering her, just observing it with the same matter-of-factness he applied to most things. I've had consultants before. They came and they looked at the surface and they told me things I mostly already knew. You came and you found things nobody else saw. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I want you to know I see that. Rowena was quiet for a second. She was not accustomed to being acknowledged, not in that particular way, without any attached agenda or expectation of something in return. In her experience, when people pointed out that she was good at her work, they were usually about to ask her to do something they didn't want to do themselves. Dane just said it and left it there. Thank you, she said, and meant it, simply. The fence crew arrived Thursday as promised. 4 men from a reliable outfit out of a town 20 miles south, led by a weathered, compact woman named Tamsin, who had been doing fencing and structural repair for going on 18 years, and who walked the flagged line with Rowena on the first morning without a word until she'd seen all 11 cuts. Then she said, Someone did this deliberately. Yes, Rowena said. Tamsin looked at her. You want me to document the condition before we repair it. It wasn't quite a question. Photographs? Measurements? Written descriptions of each cut location and the method used. Rowena held her gaze. Can you do that? Cost you more. That's fine. Tamsin nodded once, and that was the end of the negotiation. The crew worked efficiently and without a lot of conversation, the way skilled people worked when they knew what they were doing. Birch watched them from a distance with the proprietary wariness of an old-timer observing outsiders work his territory, and by the second day was making occasional suggestions that Tamsin incorporated without making a production of it, which was exactly the right approach. The east line took 4 days. Then they moved to the west boundary, where Rowena had found 3 additional suspect sections. Meanwhile, she was on the phone constantly, with Aldous, with her colleague tracking Pruitt, with the county environmental office following up on the contamination complaint, with Garrett back at the firm who needed updates and who provided, in return, both institutional support and the occasional quiet reminder that she was not immune to consequences if this went badly. I know, she told him, on a call she took walking along the north pasture fence. Granger has a lawyer on retainer who's been known to go after people who make accusations he considers unfounded, Garrett said. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying be sure. I'm building the record so I can be sure. That's the entire point. I know it is. A pause. How's the ranch? She looked out at the cattle in the north section. They'd been on clean water and the beginning of the supplement protocol for 10 days now. It was too early for visible results, but one of the older cows, a broad-shouldered animal, the color of coffee that Dane called Willa, because apparently he named them and wasn't embarrassed about it, had eaten a full ration 2 days running for the first time in weeks. "It's coming back," she said. Slowly. It was on a Saturday, 2.5 weeks after she'd arrived, that the first outside pressure showed up. Rowena was at the table with the ledgers when she heard tires on the gravel. She looked up. Through the kitchen window, she could see a truck she didn't recognize. Newer, cleaner than the vehicles that usually turned up at a working ranch, with a man in a jacket getting out of the passenger side. She heard Dane go to the door. The conversation on the porch was not long, and she could hear the general register of it without making out words. The visitor's voice had the smooth, calibrated tone of someone who'd practiced delivering messages professionally. Dane's voice was clipped. After a few minutes, the truck left. Dane came back inside. He set a business card on the table in front of Rowena. It read, "Harkin and Associates, Property and Land Acquisition." "They want to buy the ranch," Dane said. He sat down heavily. "Offered me 60% of assessed value, said it was a fair offer given the property's compromised condition." The last two words came out with something hard under them. Rowena picked up the card. "Who sent them?" "They said they were representing an independent acquisition fund." He looked at her. But the man said something interesting at the end. He said that given the complexity of my debt situation, their client had experience working with Granger's lending operation to ensure clean transitions. Rowena set the card down. "He knows someone's been asking questions," she said. "Or he suspects it. Either way, he's decided to make an offer before whatever's coming gets further along." She looked at Dane. "He's trying to get you to sell before you know what you have." "He's a little late for that." "Yes." She turned the card over. The back was blank. "Don't respond to this, not yet. Let me make a call." She called Aldous, who had spent the past week going deeper into the survey chain. Aldous had, in the past 3 days, connected Meridian Land Services to not one, but 4 other properties in the county, all of which had experienced boundary disputes, water access problems, or lending difficulties within 2 to 3 years of Meridian's involvement. 2 of those properties had been acquired at distressed prices by entities connected to Granger's portfolio. 4, Rowena said. "At minimum," Aldous said. "I'm still pulling records." She thanked her and hung up. Dane was standing at the window. She could see from where she sat that he was watching the road where the acquisition truck had gone, his arms crossed, his jaw set in the particular way it went when he was working through anger into something more useful. "There are at least 4 other ranches," she told him. "Possibly more. The same pattern. Meridian involved in each one." He turned around. "We're not the only ones," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Do those people know? Probably not the full scope. Not the way we're putting it together." She held his gaze. "Which is why we need to move carefully and completely. Because when we present this, it can't just be about Blackthorn Ridge. If we go to the county assessor with one ranch's story, Granger can argue it's a grievance from a single failed operation." She paused. "But if we go with 4 ranches, with a connected pattern documented across years, it's not a grievance anymore." Dane understood. She could see it in his face. "It's evidence," he said. "It's a case." He looked out the window again, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. The afternoon light was coming in low and yellow through the glass, laying long shadows across the kitchen floor. Outside, somewhere on the north pasture, one of the hands was moving a water line, and she could hear the distant sound of it. "My father used to say this land would outlast anything you could throw at it," Dane said. It was the first time he'd talked about his father without that particular weight in his voice. Something had shifted in him over the past 2 weeks. Not fixed, not resolved, but different. Like a man who'd been walking bent under something and had recently been told the weight wasn't his to carry. He still carried it, but he was standing straighter. "Smart man," Rowena said. "He had his moments." Dane turned back from the window. "What do you need from me?" "I need the names of the other ranchers. Any of them you know. Anyone who sold out in the last 5 years after a run of bad luck." She pulled out her notebook. "I need to know who in this county Granger doesn't own." Dane pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "All right," he said. "Let's start with what I know." He talked. She wrote. Outside, the afternoon went toward evening, and the ranch, battered and imperfect and more alive than it had been in years, held its ground against the long-coming dark. The names Dane gave her filled 2 pages of her notebook. Some of them were people still in the county, ranchers who'd survived hard years by selling off parcels, taking on outside work, or running their operations down to skeleton crews. Others had sold out entirely and moved on. 3 he knew only by their land, properties that had changed hands quietly, absorbed into larger holdings without much public notice, the way land disappeared in rural counties when nobody was paying attention. Rowena spent the next 3 days making calls and driving roads she hadn't been on before, because some conversations didn't happen over the phone. She left Dane with a list of fence repairs to oversee and the supplement protocol to manage, and the kind of trust that she hadn't fully extended to anyone on a job in a long time. The first rancher she visited was a woman named Hazel Dodd, who ran a small operation 12 miles north of Blackthorn Ridge with her adult son and had been doing so for 27 years. Hazel was in her late 60s, built like someone who'd never once in her life done anything less than what was required of her, and she met Rowena at the gate of her property with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile but simply waiting. Rowena told her why she'd come. She didn't dress it up. Hazel was quiet for a long moment after. Then she said, "I signed a document 4 years ago for a company called Meridian. Man came to the house, said it was county procedure, boundary verification." Rowena's hand tightened on her notebook. "Did you keep a copy?" she asked. Hazel looked at her. "I keep copies of everything. My husband taught me that before he passed. He said paper is the only thing that doesn't lie to you after the fact." She brought out the document. It was identical in structure to the one in Dane's files. Different parcel number, same company letterhead, same illegible agent signature. "I always thought something was off about it," Hazel said, looking at the paper in her own hands. "The man who came was too smooth, too prepared. He had answers for things I hadn't asked yet." She folded the document carefully and handed it to Rowena. "Take it. I made copies years ago. Have you had water problems, cattle performance issues?" Hazel's mouth pressed into a line. "My South herd's been underperforming for 2 years. Vet said nutritional deficiency. I switched feed, switched supplement, made a difference but never fully corrected." She paused. "I've got a creek that runs off the Granger parcel." Rowena wrote it down. The second rancher wasn't willing to talk at first. His name was Curtis Prawl, mid-50s, a man who'd sold off his back 43 years ago to cover debts he couldn't explain the origin of, and who now ran what remained of his family's property with the wariness of someone who expected the other shoe to drop at any time. He stood in his doorway and told Rowena he didn't know anything about any fraud and wasn't interested in getting involved in anything that might draw attention to himself. She understood that. She didn't push. She left her card on his porch railing and told him that if he changed his mind, the door was open. He called her that same evening. "I've got letters," he said, without preamble, when she picked up. "From the loan officer at the bank, the one who handled my renewal denial. I kept them because something felt wrong and I didn't know what to do with them." A pause. "His name is Vance, Roland Vance." Rowena wrote the name down and underlined it twice. "Curtis," she said, "can you make copies and keep them somewhere safe? Not at your house." A silence. Then, "You think this is going to get complicated?" "I think it's already complicated. I want to make sure your documentation doesn't disappear." Another silence. "All right." By the end of the week, she had confirmed connections to 6 properties, not 4. 6 ranches spread across the county, each with some variation of the same pattern. Meridian Land Services, fraudulent survey confirmation, water access problems, underperforming cattle, and at the end of the chain, debt they couldn't service, and Granger's operation positioned to acquire the pieces. She drove back to Blackthorn Ridge on a Friday evening, later than she'd intended, the last of the sun gone and the stars coming out over the hills. She'd eaten nothing since noon and was running on the particular fuel of someone who'd found the full shape of something they'd been hunting. She was also, underneath all of it, deeply angry. Not the kind of anger that made you reckless, the kind that made you careful. Dane was still up when she got in, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a map of the county spread out in front of him. He'd been marking properties on it, she could see, small red dots with notations in his handwriting. He looked up when she came in. She set her bag down, poured herself what was left in the coffee pot. heated it in the microwave without thinking about whether it deserved better, and sat down across from him. 6, she said. At minimum. Aldous thinks there may be 2 more, but she's still tracing the ownership chain. Dane looked at the map. She could see he'd already been thinking along the same lines. The properties he'd marked formed a rough geographic pattern across the county, all of them in areas with water access, good grass, or road frontage that made them commercially attractive. He was shopping, Dane said, looking for specific kinds of land, and manufacturing the conditions to buy it cheap. She looked at the map too. The Meridian contracts are the key. That's where he made a mistake, using the same company, the same structure, across multiple properties. It links them. If each property had been isolated, he could argue individual circumstances. With 6, you can't. 7, Dane said. She looked at him. I made some calls today while you were out. Man named Tilford, over near the eastern county line. His family sold out 2 years ago. He's been living in town since. He said Meridian came to them the same as us. Dane paused. He cried on the phone. He's been blaming himself for 2 years. Rowena looked at the map for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee. We have to get to the assessor's office, she said, and we have to get there before Granger figures out we've talked to this many people. The acquisition offer he sent, that was him probing, seeing if you take the money and stop asking questions. When you don't respond, he'll know you're not. How long do we have? I don't know, which is why we move now. She looked at him. I want to file the formal complaint with the assessor on Monday. I need this weekend to get the documentation organized. Your ledgers, the Meridian contracts from all 7 properties, the water test results, the survey chain Aldous has pulled together, and the correspondence Curtis Prawl has from the bank officer. She spread her hands on the table. Can you get me Saturday? No ranch emergencies, no outside calls, just you and me and this paperwork. He looked at the map one more time, then folded it. Saturday, he said. All of it. Cool. They worked through Saturday in shifts, Rowena organizing and sequencing the documentation, Dane reading through sections she handed him to confirm accuracy, both of them stopping to eat what Cora left in the kitchen before going back to it. By mid-afternoon, they had assembled something that looked, to Rowena's experienced eye, like the bones of a serious case. It wasn't clean. Real evidence rarely was. There were gaps, places where they had circumstantial connection but not direct proof, where she could show the shape of what had been done without yet being able to put Granger's hand directly on each piece. But the volume of what they had, the geographic spread, the repeated corporate structure, the timeline that placed Meridian's contracts consistently 2 to 3 years before each ranch's crisis, it was more than enough to put the whole framework in front of investigators who had the authority to subpoena what she couldn't access herself. What happens when we file Monday? Dane asked. He was sitting back in his chair looking at the stacked papers. The late afternoon light was doing what it did at this time of year, coming in low and warm and making everything look more settled than it was. The assessor's office will review the survey fraud complaint and likely refer it to the county attorney. The water contamination complaint goes to the environmental division. And Curtis Prawl's bank correspondence, that one's more complicated. That's a regulatory matter. She tapped the stack. But here's what matters. Once we file, it's on record. It's public record. And that means Granger can't make it disappear quietly anymore. He'll try to discredit us. Yes. He'll come after you specifically. You're the one who put it together. She looked at him steadily. I know. He held her gaze. I want you to know I didn't bring you into this so it would land on you. Dane. She said his name in a tone that was patient but firm. I walked into this with my eyes open. This is why I do this work. She paused. I'm not saying it won't get uncomfortable. I'm saying I'm not going to back down from it. He was quiet for a moment. I know you're not, he said, and the way he said it was different from how he'd spoken to her in the early days. Less careful, more direct. The kind of tone you used with someone you'd stopped measuring. Monday came with clouds again, low and gray, the kind that threatened without committing, and Rowena drove to the county seat with a folder thick enough to need a rubber band around it. Dane came with her, which she hadn't asked him to do but was glad of. He wore a clean shirt and his better hat and sat in the passenger seat with his hands folded in his lap and didn't talk much, The county assessor's office was on the second floor of a building that had been renovated at some point in the last 30 years, but not recently, with linoleum floors and fluorescent lighting and the particular institutional smell of places where paperwork went to get processed slowly. The assessor herself was a woman named Petworth, compact, 50s, with reading glasses that she wore on the end of her nose, and a manner that suggested she had seen most of what the county had to offer and was not easily impressed. She took the folder from Rowena, looked at the top document, and then looked at Rowena over her glasses. "You're a livestock consultant," Petworth said. "I am. I was retained to assess Blackthorn Ridge Ranch. What I found in the course of that assessment led me here." Petworth looked at Dane. "Mr. Mercer." "Ma'am," Dane said. She looked back at the folder. She didn't open it yet, which Rowena took as a sign that she was the kind of person who didn't move fast and couldn't be pushed. "You're alleging a fraudulent survey?" Petworth said. "Connected to a land acquisition 4 years ago." "I'm alleging multiple fraudulent surveys," Rowena said. "Across 7 properties in this county, all processed through the same company, Meridian Land Services, using a surveyor whose license was subsequently suspended for falsification in another county." Petworth was quiet for a moment. "7 properties," she said. "At minimum." Petworth set the folder on her desk, folded her hands on top of it, and looked at Rowena for a long moment. Then she said, "Give me 10 minutes. There's someone I want in this room." The someone turned out to be a man from the county attorney's office named Forsyth, who arrived 12 minutes later with his own reading glasses and the look of a man who'd been pulled from something else and wasn't quite sure yet whether this warranted it. He was somewhere in his 40s, wore a suit that fit reasonably well, and shook hands with the kind of professional neutrality that could go either way. Rowena walked them through it. She started with the survey, the original boundary filing for Granger's parcel above the Blackthorn Spring, the surveyor's credentials, the subsequent license suspension, the connection to Meridian Land Services. She moved to the Meridian contracts themselves, laying out 4 of the 7 on the table, showing the structural identity between them. Same format, same company, same type of agent signature. She explained the timeline, how each contract appeared 2 to 3 years before the corresponding ranch began its financial decline. Then she laid out the water contamination evidence, the test results from the Blackthorn Spring, the earthwork above it on Granger's parcel, the veterinary records showing the same pattern of nutritional compromise in cattle on other properties with similar water access situations. She put Curtis Prohl's correspondence from the bank officer on the table last. "This is a letter from a loan officer named Roland Vance to a rancher named Curtis Prohl, written 2 months before Prohl's loan renewal was denied. In it, Vance references the current situation of the property in terms that suggest prior knowledge of conditions that, according to other documentation, were manufactured." She looked at Forsyth. That letter was not supposed to exist. It appears Vance sent it by accident, an envelope mix-up, and Prohl kept it without fully understanding what it meant. Forsyth had been quiet through most of this, reading as she talked. Now he looked up. "Vance still works at the bank?" he asked. "As of last Friday." Forsyth and Petworth exchanged a look. "I want copies of everything," Forsyth said. "Original documents stay with you until I tell you otherwise. I'll need contact information for each of the other property owners. I have it with me." She pulled a separate sheet from her folder. "I'd ask that you approach those individuals carefully. Several of them are in difficult circumstances and have been living with self-blame for years. They deserve to know they're not at fault before they're put through anything official." Forsyth looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not warm, exactly, but something less neutral. "Understood." They drove back to Blackthorn Ridge mostly in silence. Rowena watched the county road go by and turned over the meeting in her mind, sorting what Forsyth's questions had told her about what he was thinking. He'd asked good questions, specific, legally precise. He'd been particularly interested in the Vance letter, which she'd expected. The bank connection was the piece that elevated everything from a complicated civil matter to something more serious. "How'd you think it went?" Dane asked, somewhere around mile 8. "Better than I expected," she said. "Forsyth is competent. Petworth is serious. They'll take it somewhere." "How long will it take?" "I don't know. Investigations like this don't move on anybody's schedule." She glanced at him. "Could be weeks before there's anything visible happening. Could be longer." She paused. Granger is going to find out, probably soon. He has people in that building, or people who talk to people in that building. The question is what he does when he finds out. Dane looked at the road ahead. What do you think he'll do? Try to discredit the evidence, try to discredit me, and try to get you to settle before anything becomes official. She turned back to the window. He'll come at it from an angle we're not expecting. That's how he operates. She was right. It took 4 days. Down. The letter arrived on a Thursday, addressed to the firm, to Garrett, specifically, not to Rowena, from an attorney named Calloway, representing Silas Granger's interests. It was 8 pages long, professionally formatted, and alleged that Rowena Hartwell had conducted an unprofessional, financially motivated investigation outside the scope of her consulting mandate, had made defamatory representations to county officials, and had pressured financially vulnerable property owners into false statements. Garrett called her while she was checking fence line with Sully. He's got a lawyer who knows what he's doing, Garrett said, after he'd read her the relevant sections. He was always going to. She walked to a fence post and leaned against it, looking at the hills. What does it say about the evidence specifically? It characterizes the survey documentation as selectively interpreted and the water contamination findings as not causally connected to his client's property. The bank correspondence it calls hearsay. Garrett paused. It also says that if the firm continues to be involved in what it calls a coordinated defamation campaign, his client reserves the right to pursue legal remedies. Of course it does. Rowena, I know. She watched a hawk working the updraft above the hill. Garrett, you know what all of this is. I know what it is. I also know that it's going to cost the firm to respond to it regardless of its merit. I know that too. She closed her eyes briefly. I'm sorry to put that on you. A pause on his end. I didn't say I'm backing off. I'm saying I need you to understand what we're walking into. I understand it. And you're sure about what you've got. She thought about Hazel Dodd pulling that Meridian contract out of a filing cabinet. She thought about Curtis Prahl's voice on the phone, the edge in it when he said he'd been blaming himself for 2 years. She thought about Tilford, who she'd never met, who'd cried on the phone with Dane. I'm sure, she said. She told Dane about the letter that evening. He read through the summary she'd written out for him and set it on the table. He's rattled, Dane said. Yes. Rattled people make mistakes. She looked at him. He wasn't wrong. The letter was aggressive in a way that told her Granger had moved faster than she'd expected, which meant he was more concerned than someone who thought his position was secure. A man who was truly comfortable didn't fire 8 legal pages at a livestock consultant within 4 days of a complaint being filed. Forsyth needs to know about this, she said. It's relevant to the investigation, an attempt to suppress the evidence before the investigation is complete. Will it help? It documents that Granger knew about the complaint and chose intimidation over cooperation. Yes, it helps. She picked up her phone. I'll call Forsyth in the morning. Dane was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the table, not at anything specific, the way he looked when he was turning something over in his mind. I've been thinking, he said. About. The other ranchers, Hazel, Curtis, Tilford, the others. He looked up. They're all dealing with this separately, each one thinking they're alone in it. He paused. What if they weren't? She waited. What if we brought them together, he said. Not just as evidence sources, as people. Let them meet each other. Let them see they're not the only one. He spread his hands on the table, because right now Granger's strategy is to keep us all separate, isolated. He can fight 7 people one at a time. 7 people in the same room is something else. Rowena sat with that for a moment. It wasn't part of the legal strategy exactly. It wasn't something Forsyth had asked for. But Dane was right about the isolation. It was a feature of the scheme, not a byproduct. Granger had targeted individual operations, and individual operations stayed individual. They didn't compare notes. They blamed themselves, until someone showed them the whole picture. It has to be done carefully, she said, not in a way that looks coordinated in a legal sense that creates problems. But if ranchers who've independently been affected choose to independently meet for dinner, Dane said, the way people do in a county where everyone knows everyone. She looked at him. There was something different in his face than there had been on the morning she'd arrived, when he'd been sitting on the porch steps like a man who'd already finished grieving. That man had been hollowed out in a specific way, like something that had been burning from the inside for a long time. This man was not that. Saturday, she said. Here, Cora's going to need some notice. Dane almost smiled. Cora's been cooking for crowds since before I was born. She'll be fine. Cora was, predictably, not fine with the 3 days of notice, and made her feelings known in specific terms while simultaneously starting a list of what she'd need from the store. It was the kind of contradiction that defined her. She complained precisely because she was already planning. By Saturday evening, 7 people sat around the extended kitchen table and the folding table Dane had pulled from the barn and set end to end with it. Hazel Dodd had come with her son. Curtis Prawl came alone, looking like a man who wasn't sure he'd made the right decision until he walked in and saw Hazel, who he apparently knew, and then relaxed marginally. A man named George Tilford, whom Rowena was meeting for the first time, arrived early and shook Dane's hand with the kind of grip that said he'd been waiting a long time to be in the same room with someone who understood. 2 of the others had sent spouses in their place for various reasons. One sent a letter. They ate first because Cora wouldn't have it any other way, and the food was good in the plain, abundant way of someone who'd been feeding working people for decades. The conversation over dinner was careful at first, the way it always was when strangers sat together around shared difficulty, each person trying to figure out how much to say and how much to hold back. Rowena let it breathe. After a while, Hazel said, "I've been blaming myself for 2 years." The table got quiet. "The South heard," Hazel continued. "The water. I kept thinking I'd missed something, that I should have caught it earlier." She looked around the table. "My son was going to college on what that ranch was supposed to earn. He went 2 years and then had to come home." She looked at her hands. "I told him it was my fault." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then George Tilford said, "I sold 40 acres I had no business selling. I told my wife I'd made a mistake. We didn't talk right for 6 months. He was looking at the table. It wasn't a mistake, but I didn't know that." Curtis Prawl was very still. "I thought I was bad with money," he said. "I've always been afraid of being bad with money. My father was." He exhaled. "Turns out I wasn't bad with money. Someone just made sure the money didn't go where I put it." Rowena watched all of them. This was the part of the work that didn't go in reports. This was the thing that happened when people who'd been carrying the same weight alone finally found themselves in the same room. It wasn't a strategy session. It wasn't evidence collection. It was something older than that, the plain, blunt relief of not being alone in a thing that had been crushing you. Dane was watching too. She could see from across the table that he was holding himself carefully because this was doing something to him that he hadn't fully prepared for. These were his neighbors. People he'd driven past on county roads for years without knowing they were fighting the same war. Later, after people had gone and Cora was doing dishes and Dane was carrying the extra table back to the barn, Rowena sat on the porch steps in the dark. He came and sat beside her after a while. "They're going to testify," he said, "if it comes to that." "Yes," she said. "They are." He was quiet for a moment. The night was clear, the stars out, the land spread out before them in the dark in its battered, living state. "Something changed in there tonight," he said. "In that room." She nodded. "It wasn't just about the case," he said. "Was it?" She thought about how to answer that. "No," she said finally. It wasn't just about the case. They sat there a while longer and the night held them, and somewhere out in the north pasture the cattle moved in the dark. And the land that had been taken from these people piece by piece over years held on as land always held on, stubbornly, quietly, waiting for the people who belonged on it to find their way back. Forsyth called on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after they'd filed the complaint, while Rowena was out checking the progress on the south pasture reseeding. She'd been watching a section of newly turned earth that had taken its first tentative green in the past few days, the kind of growth that was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, thin and pale and nowhere near what it would eventually become, but real. She picked up on the second ring. "We've subpoenaed Meridian's full corporate record," Forsyth said, without greeting, "and we've opened a formal inquiry into Roland Vance." She stood very still in the middle of the field. "The bank know?" she asked. "They were notified this morning. Vance has been placed on administrative leave pending the inquiry. A pause. I also need to tell you that we found 2 more properties. Beyond your 7. Makes 9 total. 9 ranches. 9 families. She did the math without wanting to. Years of accumulated loss, cattle that never recovered. Land sold for fractions of its worth. People who'd spent years in the dark about what had actually happened to them. "What's Granger doing?" she asked. His attorney filed an objection to the subpoena, which is standard, but Forsyth stopped for a moment in a way that told her something was coming. "We also had a visit from one of Granger's former associates, a man named Duchamp. He came in voluntarily." "What did he want?" "To talk. He was involved in the Meridian operation in an administrative capacity for about 2 years. He's been out of it for 18 months and apparently has been sitting on what he knows, trying to figure out if the risk of talking was worth it." Forsyth's voice was carefully neutral. He decided it was. Rowena closed her eyes briefly. A voluntary cooperating witness was a different weight of evidence than documents and pattern analysis. Documents could be challenged, interpretations disputed. A person who'd been inside the operation and was willing to describe what they'd seen from the inside was something a defense attorney couldn't dismiss with emotion. "Is he credible?" she asked. "Credible enough that we've been talking to him for 4 hours and I'm still on it. He's got records, his own records, things he kept." Another pause. "He kept them because he was scared. He didn't know who he could trust, and he thought if anything ever happened to him, he wanted something to exist that told the truth." She thought about what it took to sit on that for 18 months. The particular weight of knowing something and not knowing what to do with it. "Does Granger know he's talking to you?" "Not yet, but that window is closing." Forsyth's tone sharpened slightly. "Which is why I'm calling you. The hearing that Petworth's office has scheduled for the survey fraud, it was going to be in 6 weeks. We're moving it up. 2 weeks from Friday." Rowena looked at the thin green line of new grass along the turned soil. 2 weeks. "Granger will fight the timeline," she said. "He's welcome to try. The assessor's office sets its own schedule." A brief silence. "Ms. Hartwell, I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Are you prepared to present at this hearing your documentation, your findings, your methodology, in a public setting with Granger's legal team in the room?" She thought about the 8-page letter Calloway had sent to Garrett. She thought about the acquisition offer and the smooth man who'd delivered it. She thought about Hazel Dodd and Curtis Prawl and George Tilford sitting around the extended table, and the particular quality of relief in the room when people stopped being alone in something that had been breaking them. "Yes," she said, "I'm prepared." She told Dane that evening. He was at the barn checking on a heifer that had been off feed for 2 days. Nothing alarming, but the kind of thing you watched, and he looked up when she came in. She gave him the full account. Forsyth's call, the subpoena, Vance on administrative leave, Duchamp, and the hearing, 2 weeks out. Dane listened without interrupting, the way he'd learned to listen to her. Fully, without filling space. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he crouched back down beside the heifer and checked her water bucket, which was fine. "You're going to stand up in front of him," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes." "And his lawyers?" "And his lawyers?" He was quiet another moment. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Same question he'd been asking since the beginning, in different forms. "I need you at the hearing, and I need the other ranchers there if they're willing to come." She crossed her arms. "Not to testify, not officially, not at this stage. But Granger needs to see that this isn't one ranch with a grievance. He needs to see the full number of people in that room." Dane stood up slowly. He looked at the heifer, then at Rowena. "I'll call them," he said. "Every one." The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest and most concentrated stretch of work Rowena had done in years, and she'd had concentrated stretches before. She organized the presentation with the methodical obsessiveness of someone who understood that the strength of what she'd assembled lived or died in its clarity, not just whether the evidence was there, but whether a room full of non-specialists could follow the logic of it without getting lost. She built it in sequence. Survey fraud first. The boundary manipulation was the most concrete piece, the most visually demonstrable. Then the Meridian contracts, their structural identity, their timing relative to each ranch's decline. Then the water contamination, the veterinary records, the livestock performance data, then the fence sabotage documentation, Tamsin's photographs and written assessments from Blackthorn Ridge, corroborated by similar findings from two other properties whose owners had gone back and looked after the Saturday dinner. Then the lending pattern, ending with the Vance correspondence, which she presented last because it was the piece that closed the loop between the physical manipulation of the ranches and the financial mechanism that turned that manipulation into acquisition. She rehearsed it twice in the kitchen with Dane as her audience, which was uncomfortable for both of them in different ways. He was not a natural audience, and she was not a natural performer, but which was useful because he asked questions a real audience would ask and pointed out twice where her explanation assumed knowledge the room wouldn't have. "Here," he said, pointing at her notes on the survey section. "You said the boundary deviation was 0.3 acres. That sounds small. It's not small in terms of water rights. You know that. The assessor probably knows that. The three other people in the room won't." He tapped the page. "Explain what 0.3 acres means when a spring sits on the wrong side of a line." She rewrote the section. He was right, and she knew it, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about Dane Mercer over these weeks. He had a specific kind of intelligence that didn't always announce itself, the practical, lateral kind that came from a lifetime of solving problems that didn't come with instructions. He didn't think the way she thought, and that was valuable. She was thinking about that on the evening before the hearing, sitting on the porch with the last light going. She was thinking about the specific quality of useful that someone became when you'd been in the middle of something hard together for long enough. She heard him come out. He sat down in the chair next to hers, not the steps like he usually did, and for a while neither of them said anything. The night was clear, the stars appearing one by one as the sky darkened. "You nervous?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Yes." He seemed surprised she'd admitted it. "What are you nervous about specifically?" "That I've missed something, that there's a gap in the logic that Calloway finds before I do." She looked at the dark hills. "I've been over it 40 times. I know it holds. But the moment before you find out if something holds is always the hardest part." He nodded slowly. "My father used to say the worst time was the night before shipping day, when you'd done everything you could and there was nothing left to do but wait and see if the work was enough." "Smart man, your father." "He had his moments," Dane said. The same words he'd used weeks ago, but this time with less weight behind them. Something had shifted in how he talked about his father since the night of the dinner. Like naming what had actually happened to this ranch had freed him from a story he'd been telling himself about his own failure. That story was still there, she suspected. These things didn't disappear, but it had loosened its hold. "For what it's worth," he said after a moment, "you haven't missed anything. I've watched you work. I've seen how you go at a problem." He paused. "You don't miss things." She looked at him. "That's not me trying to make you feel better," he said. "That's an observation." She turned back to the night. "Thank you." A longer silence, the comfortable kind that had become more common between them in recent weeks. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but of people who didn't always need to fill the space. "After tomorrow," he said, "whatever happens, I want you to know that what you did here—" He stopped, started again. "I would have lost this ranch. In 2 months, maybe 3, and I would have spent the rest of my life thinking it was because I wasn't good enough." His voice was steady, but only just. "That's not a small thing, to take that away from someone." She didn't look at him because she thought if she did, it might become something different than what it was, and she didn't want to rush that or break it. "The ranch isn't saved yet," she said. "No," he said, "but it's going to be." He said it the way you said a thing when you finally actually believed it, not as hope, as fact. The hearing was held in the county assessor's conference room, which was larger than Rowena had expected and which filled up on the morning of the hearing in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. Word had moved through the county in the way that word moved in places where people knew each other. Not through announcement, but through conversation. Through one person telling another that something was finally happening about what everyone had quietly suspected for years. Hazel Dodd was there with her son. Curtis Prawl came with a woman Rowena hadn't met, a neighbor who'd driven him because he didn't trust himself to drive straight, he said. George Tilford sat in the second row with his wife, who was small and quiet, and held his hand the entire time. The other ranchers were there, or their families. The man who'd sent a letter instead of coming to the dinner was there in person, which surprised her. She counted 23 people in the room before she stopped counting. Silas Granger sat at the far table with Calloway and two associates, and she let herself look at him for only a moment when she came in. He was older than she'd expected from his name, somewhere in his late 60s, well-dressed in the particular way of men who spent money on appearances while conducting ugly business. He had the face of someone who'd been successful long enough that it had started to look like his natural right. He didn't look at her directly. He looked past her, the way powerful people sometimes looked at the people they didn't consider threats. She set her materials on the table and sat down. Petworth opened the hearing with a procedural summary: the complaint filed, the scope of the assessor's review, the limitations of the current proceeding. She was clear and dry about it, which Rowena appreciated. This wasn't a courtroom. It was an administrative hearing. It couldn't put anyone in prison, and it couldn't award damages. What it could do was establish an official record of findings that would inform everything that came after. Calloway made an opening objection about the timeline, which Petworth dismissed in 2 sentences. Then she looked at Rowena. "Ms. Hartwell, you may begin." Rowena stood up and started with the survey. She'd prepared a simple diagram, nothing fancy, just a clean drawing of the spring, the parcel boundary, and the difference between where the line actually sat and where the fraudulent survey had placed it. She put it on the board and pointed to the deviation without editorializing. 3/10 of an acre. She explained what that meant when the spring sat on that 3/10, that the water source feeding a working ranch's south herd had been placed on paper under the legal jurisdiction of an adjacent property owner, which gave that owner the right to conduct activities affecting that water without legal liability to the ranch below. The surveyor who certified this boundary, she said, had his professional license suspended 14 months after this survey was filed for falsification of boundary reports in 2 other counties. His license number appears on surveys connected to Meridian Land Services across 9 properties in this county. She turned to her documentation stack. "I have the license records, the suspension order, and the connecting documentation." Calloway stood up. "I'd like to note for the record that connecting a surveyor's subsequent professional difficulties to the validity of prior surveys is speculative." "Counselor." Petworth looked at him over her glasses. "You'll have time to respond. Sit down." He sat. Rowena moved to the Meridian contracts. She laid them out on the board in sequence, 7 of the 9, because 2 property owners had not yet located their copies, though both had confirmed signing similar documents. She walked through the structural identity of the contracts, the timeline, the geographic distribution across the county. Each of these contracts was signed by the property owner in good faith, in the belief that they represented a routine county procedure. Each contract confirmed the accuracy of a survey that has since been connected to a surveyor whose license was revoked for falsification. She looked at the room. The effect of each contract was to cause the property owner to certify the accuracy of a fraudulent boundary, thereby limiting their legal options if they later discovered and challenged the boundary placement. The room was very quiet. Calloway objected twice more during the water contamination section, once more during the fence documentation, and then went quiet in a way that was either tactical or had something to do with the fact that Duchamp's name appeared in the fence contractor records that Rowena laid out, connecting the company that had billed Dane for work it didn't do to an entity in Meridian's corporate family. She had not known, when she prepared this presentation, whether Duchamp's name would mean anything in this room. It clearly meant something to Calloway. The change in his posture was small, but she'd been watching for it. She moved to the lending records. The pattern of loan denial, followed by Granger's lending operation appearing as alternative credit. The terms. The timeline. And then Curtis Prahl's letter from Roland Vance, which she read from in full, the relevant section carefully, without excess context, and which described the anticipated transition of Prahl's property in language that assumed knowledge of the ranch's collapse before that collapse had officially been determined. She set the letter down. This letter was sent to Mr. Prahl in error, approximately 2 months before his loan renewal was denied. In it, the bank officer refers to a situation that, at the time of writing, did not yet officially exist. She looked at Petworth. It suggests that the denial was not the result of an objective assessment of Mr. Prahl's financial standing, but of a pre-existing arrangement. Petworth was writing something down. "Mr. Vance," Petworth said without looking up, is currently the subject of a separate inquiry by the county attorney's office. I want that on the record." Calloway was on his feet immediately. "That inquiry has not produced any findings. On the record," Petworth said calmly, "means it is noted. It does not mean it is a finding." She looked at him once, then back at her notes. "Please continue, Ms. Hartwell." The response from Calloway, when it came, was professionally constructed and hit every point she'd expected. He argued that the surveyor's license issues were subsequent and separate from the surveys in question. He argued that Meridian Land Services was a legitimately operating company that had provided services to multiple clients without any finding of fraud. He argued that the water contamination findings were correlational, not causal. He argued that the fence documentation from one property could not be extrapolated across a countywide pattern without direct evidence of Granger's involvement in each specific case. He was good. She'd known he would be. He was also, she noticed, very carefully not addressing the Vance letter. He had mentioned it exactly once, in passing, called it a fragment of private correspondence taken out of context, and moved on quickly. That was the tell. That was the piece he had no clean answer for. When Petworth gave Rowena time to respond to Calloway's objections, she stood up and addressed each point methodically. She'd anticipated most of them. She had backup documentation for the survey argument, a second surveyor's analysis she'd commissioned 2 weeks ago, which examined the disputed boundary using original land deeds that predated the Meridian era, and which concluded that the current survey line was inconsistent with the historical record by the exact deviation she'd presented. She put that report on the table. "This analysis," she said, "was conducted by a licensed surveyor with 22 years of professional practice and no prior connection to any party in this proceeding. His conclusion is that the boundary as currently recorded cannot be reconciled with the historical land records without assuming an error or alteration in the survey process." Calloway objected. Petworth noted the objection and looked at the report anyway. Then Granger leaned over and said something to Calloway in a low voice. Calloway listened, straightened, and said, "My client would like to request a brief recess." Petworth looked at the clock on the wall. She looked at Granger. Then she looked at the room full of people who had driven from various corners of the county to be in this room on a Friday morning. 10 minutes, she said. Rowena stepped into the hallway. Dane followed. Hazel Dodd came out too and stood with them without saying anything, just being present in the way she had. "How do you think it's going?" Dane asked. "Better than I'd hoped," she said honestly. "Calloway's avoiding the Vance letter. That's his weakest point, and he knows it." She leaned against the wall. "The survey report surprised him. I could see it." "You didn't tell me about the second surveyor," Dane said. "I didn't want to add it to your worry list." She looked at him. "I commissioned it 8 days ago, and I wasn't sure it would be ready in time." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd come to recognize, the one he used when he was deciding whether to push back or let it go. He let it go. "What happens in there when we go back in?" Hazel asked. Her voice was steady, her arms crossed, her eyes on the door. "Petworth will hear Calloway's response to the survey report. She'll make findings on the survey fraud question specifically. That's within her jurisdiction. The broader fraud allegation goes to Forsyth and the county attorney." Rowena looked at the door too. "Today isn't the end of this, but it's the end of the part where Granger gets to pretend there's nothing to look at." Hazel nodded once. They went back in. What Granger had asked Calloway for during the recess became clear in the next 20 minutes. Calloway presented a revised position, not an admission, framed carefully as a goodwill gesture, a willingness to cooperate with any legitimate boundary review process. He suggested that his client was open to a voluntary resurvey of the relevant parcel boundary, to be conducted jointly with the assessor's office. Rowena watched Petworth's face while Calloway spoke. Petworth looked like a woman listening to something she'd heard variations of before. When Calloway finished, Petworth looked at Granger directly, not at his lawyer, and said, "Mr. Granger, do you understand that a voluntary resurvey, at this stage, does not affect the assessor's ability to make findings regarding the original survey documentation?" A beat. Granger looked at his lawyer. Calloway nodded slightly. "Yes," Granger said. His voice was controlled, the voice of a man who'd spent decades controlling rooms. But it was also, Rowena thought, The voice of a man who understood that a room had just stopped being controllable. Petworth made a note. Then she said, "I'm going to make a preliminary finding in this matter today, before formal investigation is complete. Based on the documentation presented and the evidence before this office, I am finding reasonable cause to believe that the survey filed in connection with the acquisition of the parcel designated LO7749 was inaccurate in a manner that materially affected the property rights of Blackthorn Ridge Ranch." She looked at her papers. "This finding will be referred to the county attorney for further investigation. The assessor's office will additionally conduct its own review of survey records connected to Meridian Land Services across all properties identified in today's presentation." The room made a sound, not a cheer, the wrong word, more like a collective exhale, the sound of people who had been holding something for a long time, letting it out. Calloway was already talking, objections and reservations and legal qualifications, and Petworth was noting each one with the patient efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and was not moved. Rowena sat down. She put her hands flat on the table, looked at the stack of papers in front of her, and breathed. Dane's hand came to rest briefly on the table next to hers. Not touching, close. She looked up at him. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at Petworth writing her finding into the official record. But the gesture said what it said. They were outside afterward, the whole group of them, in the parking lot of the county building with the gray clouds still overhead, and the air cold and the kind of uncertain sunshine that came and went without committing. People were talking, groups forming and reforming, Hazel holding both of Curtis Prahl's hands and saying something to him while he nodded. George Tilford and his wife standing close together, not talking, just standing. Forsyth appeared at Rowena's elbow. "Good work in there," he said. He wasn't the type to say it with excess feeling, which was why it carried weight. "The second survey report made the difference." "The Vance letter made the difference," he said. "Calloway barely touched it, and that's because he can't. What Vance wrote in that letter predates events it shouldn't have had knowledge of." He glanced across the parking lot. "We've been at Vance since last week. He's scared. Scared people talk, eventually. He'll give you Granger? He'll give us the mechanism. Whether that's enough for a criminal referral depends on what the county attorney decides to do with it." Forsyth looked at her. "But the civil side, the fraudulent surveys, the contamination liability, the invalid debt instruments, that's going to move. Granger's position on those debts is compromised the moment Petworth's finding goes into the official record, which it just did." She understood what that meant for Dane, for all of them. Debt instruments built on fraudulent foundations were challengeable. The foreclosure proceedings, the loan terms, all of it went back to the table. "How long?" she asked. "Months, maybe longer." He said it without apology. "This doesn't resolve overnight, but the direction of it is clear." He paused. "Tell Mr. Mercer to stop worrying about the foreclosure timeline. We'll be in touch with his bank." He went back inside. She stood in the parking lot and let the weight of that settle. Not celebration. She was too tired for that, and too aware of how much work was still ahead. But something. The particular feeling of having walked into a problem from one side and walked out the other changed by the passage. Dane found her. He'd been talking to George Tilford and came over with his hat in his hands, turning it the way he did when he was managing something internally. "Forsyth," he said, "the foreclosure timeline. He said to stop worrying about it." Dane stopped turning his hat. "He'll be in touch with the bank," she said. "The finding Petworth just made, it affects the legal standing of the debt structure. It's not gone overnight, but it's challenged, officially." He looked at the county building, then at the parking lot full of people who'd driven here from across the county and were still here, still talking, still standing on the same ground. "My father's ranch," he said quietly. Not to her, not exactly, just saying it. She didn't say anything. "He's not going to get it," Dane said. The flatness in it was different from the flatness she'd heard in his voice on the first morning. That one had been exhaustion. This one was something that had settled, like a stone that had found the bottom. "No," she said, "he's not." They stood there a while in the cold parking lot, and around them the county moved in its ordinary way. And inside the building, Petworth's finding was being typed into a record that would exist long after this day was done. The clouds shifted. A long arm of winter sun came through and lit the ground for a moment. then was gone. Hazel Dodd came over. She looked at Rowena with the direct, unsentimental look of a woman who had spent 60-some years calling things what they were. "You did that," she said. "Not praise exactly. Recognition." "We did it," Rowena said. Hazel made a small sound that might have been disagreement, then let it go. She put her coat on and looked out at the parking lot where her son was waiting by the truck. "I'm going to go home," she said, "and cook a meal I've been putting off for 2 years because I never thought I'd feel like eating it." She looked at Rowena one more time. "Thank you." She walked to her truck and drove away. Curtis Prawl left next, then Tilford and his wife. The parking lot emptied in pieces, and eventually it was just Rowena and Dane and the cold air and the sound of the county going about its business. "We should get back," she said. "Yeah." He put his hat on. "Birch is probably wondering where we are." They walked to the truck. She got in the passenger side, which had happened gradually over the past weeks without anyone deciding it. Somewhere along the way it had become his truck and her navigation, and neither of them had commented on it. He started the engine. "Rowena," he said. She looked at him. He seemed like he was going to say something. Then he looked at the road ahead and said, "Nothing. Never mind." She turned back to her window, but she was almost certain she knew what it was. And she thought that leaving it for another time, a time when the courthouse was not in the rear view and the adrenaline had fully cleared, was probably the right call. He pulled out of the parking lot and onto the county road, and they drove back toward Blackthorn Ridge, and the land went by outside her window in its battered, surviving way. And somewhere behind them, Silas Granger was sitting in a room with his lawyers figuring out how to stop what had already started. He wasn't going to be able to stop it. They both knew that now. Roland Vance talked on a Tuesday in February, 4 months after the hearing. Forsyth called Rowena with the news while she was at the livestock broker's yard 2 counties over, looking at a group of 12 heifers that the broker had pulled specifically because he knew what she needed and what she could spend. She stepped away from the pen and stood between 2 trailers in the cold, with the phone against her ear, and listened to Forsyth describe, in his careful, legally measured way, what Vance had given them. It was everything. Not just the mechanism, not just the how, but the full chronology. Vance had been receiving payments from a shell entity connected to Granger's portfolio for 3 years. In exchange, he had flagged renewal applications from targeted ranchers as high risk regardless of their actual financial standing, ensured those denials went through without internal review, and in 2 cases actively steered borrowers toward Granger's lending operation by name. He'd kept records. Not out of conscience, Forsyth was clear on that, but because Vance was the kind of man who believed that documentation was protection, who thought that having evidence of the arrangement gave him leverage if things ever went wrong. It had not worked out the way he'd hoped. "Criminal referral?" Rowena asked. "County attorney made it this morning. Granger's attorney was notified an hour ago." A pause. "It's going to be a long process. It won't be clean and it won't be fast, but the referral is in." She stood there between the trailers with the cold working through her jacket and thought about what a long time 4 months was, and also how short it was against the years these people had lost. "The debt instruments?" she asked. "The court issued a suspension of foreclosure proceedings against Blackthorn Ridge and 3 other properties last month. You know that." Forsyth paused. "The broader challenge to all 9 properties is moving through civil court. The fraudulent survey finding from Petworth's office is in the record. Granger's legal team has been trying to negotiate a settlement structure." "What kind of settlement?" "The kind where he makes the debts go away quietly, in exchange for everyone agreeing not to pursue further civil action." Another pause. "I told them the county attorney's criminal referral made that conversation largely irrelevant." She looked back at the heifer pen. The broker was watching her with the patience of a man who'd seen consultants take phone calls before. "Forsyth," she said. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when there's a verdict." But his voice had something in it that wasn't quite the official neutrality he usually maintained. "You built the record. We followed it." She hung up and went back to look at the heifers. She bought 10 of the 12. The other 2 weren't quite right. She could see it in their hindquarter development, and the broker didn't argue with her assessment because he knew she was correct and he had a reputation to protect. They arranged transport for the following week. Driving back to Blackthorn Ridge, she called Dane. "Vance talked," she said when he picked up. A silence on his end, then, "All of it?" "Enough. Criminal referral went in this morning. She heard him exhale. Not a dramatic sound, just a man letting go of something he'd been holding at tension for a long time. The heifers? He asked after a moment, because that was how Dane processed large news. By returning immediately to the practical, the next thing, the work that was in front of him. She'd come to understand that about him. It wasn't avoidance. It was the way a man stayed functional when the ground kept shifting. 10. Transport next week. She watched the road. They're good animals. Good, he said. Then, Rowena. Yeah. Come home safe. She almost said something. Then she just said, I will. Spring came to Blackthorn Ridge the way it always came to high country. Reluctantly, with setbacks, with cold snaps in March that killed 2 weeks of warmth and turned the new grass pale before it recovered. The south pasture receding took hold unevenly, better in the lower sections where the soil had more moisture, sparse in the upper areas where the compaction from the mineral contamination was still working its way out of the ground. Rowena walked it every week and recorded what she saw without sugarcoating it. The upper section is going to need a second seeding in May, she told Dane, standing in the field with the wind moving through the knee-high green below them and the rougher, patchy growth above. He looked at it. How much of the season does that cost us? It pushes the south herd's return to this pasture by 6 weeks, maybe 8. She watched his face. He was doing the math she'd already done. 8 weeks less grazing capacity, the supplement costs to make up the difference, against the budget they were running. It's manageable, she said. It's not easy, but it's manageable. He nodded. He'd gotten better at distinguishing between those two things over the winter. Manageable and easy. He used to treat them as the same category. Now he didn't. The 10 new heifers were integrating well with the existing herd, which had by April recovered to a degree that the livestock nutritionist called, in her quarterly report, significantly better than projected outcomes. That phrase had made Rowena sit with her coffee for a moment the morning she'd read it. Better than projected. As though the cattle had decided, on their own biological schedule, to push past the estimate. Willa, the broad-shouldered, coffee-colored cow that Dane had named years ago, had delivered a healthy calf in March. Dane had come to find Rowena at 2 a.m. when it was happening, not because he needed help, but because he'd wanted her to see it, and she'd stood in the barn in her coat and boots, watching the calf work its way to standing on uncertain legs, while Willa did what she'd apparently done 3 times before with the brisk competence of experience. That's something, Rowena had said. The wrong word, maybe, but true. Yeah, Dane had said. He'd been smiling in the dim barn light in the unguarded way that people smiled when they thought no one was paying attention. It is. The formal resolution of the debt dispute came in late April, not as a courtroom verdict, but as a court order vacating the debt instruments tied to the 4 properties where the fraudulent survey connection had been most directly established. Blackthorn Ridge was among them. The loan Dane had taken from Granger's lending operation, the one that had felt like a lifeline and turned out to be a trap, was declared unenforceable due to the fraud embedded in its underlying structure, Forsyth called. Dane was in the equipment shed when it happened, and Rowena went to find him. She handed him the phone and let Forsyth tell him directly. She stood in the doorway of the shed and watched him listen. He didn't move much. He asked 2 questions she couldn't hear the full text of. Then he said thank you and handed the phone back. He stood in the shed for a moment. She didn't say anything. It's gone, he said. The loan. The number that had been sitting at the bottom of every calculation for 3 years like ballast dragging him under. It's just gone. Yes. He sat down on an overturned crate. Not dramatically. He just needed to sit. She leaned against the door frame and let him have the moment. Outside, Birch was moving a water line in the north pasture, and she could hear the familiar sound of it, and the cattle were somewhere in the middle distance, and the spring light was coming through the shed's single window and laying a bar of gold across the dirt floor. I don't know what to do with that, Dane said. You don't have to do anything with it today. She crossed her arms. It takes a while for good news to settle when you're not used to it. He looked at her. There was something in his face she'd seen growing slowly since January, a kind of steadiness that hadn't been there when she'd arrived. Not ease, exactly. Life on a working ranch didn't produce ease, but something that looked like a man who'd found his footing in his own story again. I've been thinking, he said. That's rarely the opening of good news. A small laugh. No, I've been thinking about the winter, what we built here. He turned the crate brace in his hands. You came to do an assessment. You ended up doing about 12 other things on top of that. It happens. I know it does. With you specifically. He put the brace down. I want to ask you something, and I want you to take it seriously before you answer. She waited. I need someone here. Not a consultant. Not someone who's passing through. He met her eyes directly. I need a partner in the operation. Someone who knows this land now and someone who's a part of this. He paused. I know that's not what you came here to do. I know you've got the firm and other ranches and other work. Another pause. I'm asking you to think about whether this is where you want to put down. The shed was quiet. Birch's water line running somewhere outside. A horse shifting in its stall in the adjacent barn. She looked at him for a long moment. You're asking me to stay, she said. I'm asking you to consider it. He was careful with it. He wasn't pushing. He was the kind of man who'd rather say a thing once clearly than say it 3 times and have it come out wrong. Because I think you've been looking for a place that needed the kind of work you do. And I think this is it. And I think... He stopped. I think you know what else I think. She did. She'd known for a while. And if she was being honest with herself, which she'd been doing incrementally on the long drives back from court hearings and broker yards and neighboring ranches, she'd been thinking about it too. I'd need to have a conversation with Garrett, she said. I know. And I'd need time to handle the cases I'm currently on. I know that too. And I'm difficult to work with. He looked at her steadily. I know. You've said you know a lot of things. I've had a lot of time to think about it. He picked up the brace again, turned it once, set it back down. The nervous habit he had when he was holding something carefully. I don't need an answer today. She looked at the bar of light on the dirt floor. She thought about the spring she'd left when she was 22, the land her family had lost, the specific grief of that she'd carried into this work and made useful. She thought about what Hazel Dodd had said in the parking lot. You did that, and how she'd deflected it, and how Hazel had let her deflect it and hadn't pushed. She thought about standing in the barn at 2 a.m, watching a calf find its legs. I'm not saying yes today, she said. I'm not asking for yes today. But I'm not saying no either. Something shifted in his face. Not celebration, just relief. The quiet kind. Okay, he said. Okay, she said back. She pushed off from the doorframe and went back to the pasture report she'd been working on. By the time May arrived, the county had become a different place in small ways that added up. George Tilford reseeded his back 40 with a grass mixture Rowena had recommended and called Dane to report that the germination rate was better than anything he'd gotten in 4 years. Hazel Dodd applied for a county agricultural improvement grant that she'd been too discouraged to apply for previously and was approved. Curtis Prahl's loan at the bank had been reviewed following the Vance investigation and restructured under terms that an independent assessor determined were fair. 3 of the 9 ranches had applied through the civil process for compensation from Granger's seized assets, a process that was going to take time and a good attorney and probably significant patience. 2 had already retained representation. The county attorney's criminal case was proceeding through its slow, grinding institutional motions, and Forsyth reported that Granger's legal team had made 2 settlement offers and been turned down both times. Granger's land holdings were under a court-ordered freeze pending resolution of the fraud investigation. The parcel above Blackthorn Ridge's South Spring, the one where the drainage work had been installed, the one whose fraudulent boundary had started all of it, was being reviewed for compelled remediation, meaning that at some point, someone was going to have to undo what had been done to that water source. Rowena had submitted a technical report to the court outlining exactly what that remediation should involve. She'd done it without being asked, because it needed to be done and nobody else was going to do it. Forsyth had called to thank her. You didn't have to do that, he said. The spring needs to run clean, she said. Someone had to describe what that means technically. Still, how's the case? Moving, he said. Slowly. As long as it's moving. On a Saturday in late May, Dane drove the truck to the south pasture and parked at the top of the rise where the spring came out of the hillside. The remediation crew had been there the week before. A different kind of earthwork than what Granger had installed, careful and specific, aimed at redirecting the drainage away from the spring's watershed rather than into it. It would take time to see results. These things always did. But the flow was stronger than it had been. Not strong enough yet, but stronger. Rowena stood beside him, and they both looked at it without saying much. The stones that framed the spring's outlet, the careful flat stone work that someone had built a long time ago, a person she'd never know, putting thought into land they were trying to steward well, those were still there. The water moved over them and kept going. My grandfather built that, Dane said. He'd never told her that before. She looked at the stonework. He did good work. He was particular about water. Said water was the argument the land made for itself. He looked at the spring. He meant, if you take care of the water, the land takes care of you. Something like that. She thought about that. The argument the land made for itself. She'd been in this work long enough to have seen it from both directions. Land that had been taken apart by neglect or greed, going quiet and thin and hostile. And land that had been looked after or returned to after damage, coming back with a stubbornness that sometimes felt almost personal. Blackthorn Ridge had that quality. It had held on through things that should have broken it. My family's ranch, she said. She hadn't talked about it at length since the first week. The spring there ran off a hillside, too. Different country, different geology, but the same idea. She looked at the water. After we lost the place, I used to think about that spring sometimes, whether whoever bought it was taking care of it. Were they? I don't know. I never went back to look. She paused. I think I was afraid of what I'd find. He was quiet for a moment. You could go look now, he said, if you wanted. She considered that. Not the logistics of it. She knew the logistics. The question was whether she wanted to, whether the wound was old enough that looking at the scar wouldn't open it back up. She was 31 now. She'd built something in the years between 22 and now. Not the land she'd lost, but something else. A knowledge, a capability, a record of having walked into hard places and found her way through them. She thought that maybe that was enough to go back on. Maybe, she said, sometime. He nodded. They stood there a while longer, the two of them and the spring and the sound of water moving over old stone. She called Garrett the following Monday. He listened to everything she said without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You want to leave the firm, he said. I want to stay on as a consulting associate, project basis. She'd worked this part out carefully. I'm not disappearing. I'll take cases where I'm the right person for them, but my primary base changes. To a cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere. To a cattle ranch that's building something. She paused. I'm the right person for what needs to happen there, and it needs to keep happening. Another silence. She could hear him in his office. The familiar sounds of it. The chair that creaked. The coffee he always let go cold. You know what you're doing? He asked. I know what I'm doing. This is about the work, he said, or it's about the man. She thought about how to answer that honestly. I think, she said, that when the work and the person are pointing in the same direction, it's not useful to separate them. Garrett made a sound that was the closest he usually got to a laugh. All right, he said. Project basis. We'll write something up. A pause. Rowena, I'm glad you found something worth staying for. She thanked him and hung up. Then she sat in the kitchen of Blackthorn Ridge, her kitchen now, or becoming it, and looked out the window at the pasture and the hills and the working, imperfect, surviving land, and let herself feel the full weight of having arrived somewhere without knowing she'd been looking. Boom. She told Dane that evening. He was on the porch, where she often found him at the end of the day, looking at the land in the way he had. Not romantic about it, not sentimental, just paying attention. The way a person looked at something they were responsible for and intended to keep being responsible for. She came out and sat beside him. I called Garrett, she said. He looked at her. Project basis, cases that need me specifically. She held his gaze. But Blackthorn Ridge is the base. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, Are you sure? She appreciated that he asked. He could have just accepted it. He asked because he wanted to know she'd made the choice fully, not because it was easier than the alternative. I'm sure, she said. He nodded once. The particular Dane Mercer nod she'd learned, the one that meant he'd received something important and was putting it in the right place. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They sat for a while in the cooling evening. The herd was visible in the north pasture, moving slowly in the way cattle moved when they weren't troubled by anything, which was what health looked like at a distance. Birch had gone home at 5, and the ranch had the settled quiet of a place that had finished its day's work. Somewhere in the barn, Willa's calf was learning, day by day, how to exist in the world it had been born into. Things she knew about staying. It wasn't one decision. It was a series of smaller ones, made every morning, to keep showing up for the thing you'd chosen. She'd watched her parents make those decisions for 22 years before everything collapsed. She'd spent 9 years after that carrying the lesson without knowing exactly where to put it. She was putting it here. There was something she'd been thinking about since the hearing, since the parking lot, since the night Dane had said a thing he'd been going to say and then decided to leave for later. The truth was that the people who'd assembled in that county building, Hazel and Curtis and George Tilford and the others, had done something that the law couldn't do for them. The law could restore the debt. It could void the fraudulent instruments. It could send Silas Granger through whatever process awaited him. But the law couldn't give back the years of self-blame. It couldn't return the conversations people had had with themselves at 2 in the morning, the ways they'd rebuilt their sense of themselves around the assumption of their own failure. The only thing that could address that was other people. The room on Saturday night, the parking lot, the phone calls and the shared meals and the slow, unglamorous process of saying out loud, "You were not the problem. The problem was done to you." That was not a legal remedy. It was a human one. And it was, she thought, the part of the work that mattered most and got written about least. The part where people found each other after being isolated deliberately, and in finding each other, stopped being alone. She looked at Dane beside her on the porch. He was not a man who talked about himself easily. He was not without his damage. He still woke sometimes in the early hours. She could see it in him on those mornings, the particular tiredness behind the eyes. Though less often than before, he still carried the weight of the years he'd spent believing the failure was his. That didn't disappear. That was the kind of thing that sat in a person and slowly changed its character over time, from something sharp to something duller, more manageable, until eventually it was less a wound and more a scar. Still there, still part of the geography of a person, but no longer bleeding. He was getting there. So was she, in her own way, with her own old losses. That was the thing nobody talked about, honestly. How long these things actually took. How the resolution of a legal matter and the resolution of what it did to a person were on completely different timescales, and the second one took years longer than the first. She'd known that from her own experience. She knew it more concretely now, watching the people of this county begin the long work of figuring out who they were after something that had tried to define them as failures. They weren't failures. They were people who'd been targeted by someone who'd calculated that their isolation and their pride and their unwillingness to ask for help would keep them from ever comparing notes. That calculation had been correct for a long time, until it wasn't. The sun was almost gone now, the sky going through its last colors. Orange fading into something deeper, the hills going dark at their edges. In a month, the days would be long enough that this light would still be here at 9 in the evening. The ranch would be full into its summer operations by then. The south pasture reseeding was going to need to be assessed. The second group of cattle needed their 30-day follow-up with the nutritionist. The court case would still be moving through its process, and Forsyth would call with updates. And there would be days when the whole thing felt as remote and bureaucratic as it always did, and then days when it felt immediate and necessary. Dane shifted beside her. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking. You've got a specific look when it's something you're working out versus something you've decided." He glanced at her. "That's the working out look." She looked at him. "When did you learn to read me that well?" "About a month in." He said it simply. "You work out loud, just not with words." She turned back to the darkening horizon. She wasn't sure what to do with how well he'd been paying attention. She was still getting used to being seen clearly by someone and not minding it. "I was thinking about the people," she said, "Hazel and the others, what it actually takes to come back from something like this." He was quiet for a moment, then, "A long time." "Yes. And other people." "Yes." She paused. "That's the part that doesn't show up in the case files." He nodded slowly. My father used to say that land remembers who works it, he said. He meant it practically, that the land held the record of how it had been treated. You could read years of history in the soil if you knew how to look. He was quiet a moment. I think people are like that too. They hold the record of what's been done to them. And you can read it if you know how. She thought about that. It was, she thought, exactly right. And it was why the work she'd been doing here, the official work and the unofficial work, the legal and the human, couldn't be separated. Because land and the people who worked it kept the same kind of records. And the healing of one was connected to the healing of the other. Blackthorn Ridge had been taken apart slowly, deliberately, and it had been put back together the same way. Slowly, imperfectly, by people working in the same direction. It wasn't finished. These things were never finished. But it was far enough along that you could stand at the end of a day and see it. The herd moving in the north pasture, the south spring running stronger, the fence line holding where it had been cut and repaired, the grass coming back in the lower sections and struggling in the upper ones, and that was all right because struggle was part of it, always had been. The stars were coming out. She and Dane sat on the porch of their ranch and watched the night settle over the land, and neither of them felt the need to fill it. That was its own kind of thing, the kind you couldn't manufacture and couldn't rush, and that showed up, when it showed up, as the quiet evidence of something built. Tomorrow, Dane said eventually. Tomorrow, she agreed. There was nothing more required. Tomorrow there would be work and difficulty, and the slow accumulation of days. That was what a life actually looked like from the inside. There would be setbacks. She knew that. He knew that. And court dates and bad weather and animals that got sick and machinery that failed and all the ordinary weight of ordinary days. But there would also be this land. This recovered, battered, surviving land that had held on through everything that had been done to it. And the people on it, imperfect and still healing and showing up anyway. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. The night stretched out over Blackthorn Ridge and the stars came fully out, and the cattle moved somewhere in the dark. And the spring ran clean down the hillside the way it was supposed to, and the land went on in its stubbornly living way. And the two people on the porch let the silence hold them. And it did.